Thursday's summit in Tokyo between the South Korean and Japanese leaders made international headlines, with foreign media outlets underscoring the 12-year absence of bilateral visits solely for the purpose of a two-way summit. So what has been the foreign media response to the restaurant hopping by Yoon and Kishida following their summit? What's a political pundit saying about this latest diplomatic interaction between the two leaders? And what are the prospects of lasting results from this diplomatic effort to mend ties? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we touch upon the foreign media response to Thursday's summit between President Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida over in Tokyo. For this purpose, I have Nicola Smith here in the studio with me. Nicola, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Jacco Zwetsloot with us. Jacco, welcome back.
Thank you. It's nice to be here again.
Right. Nicola, let's begin on a light note with the focus, perhaps, on the two dinners enjoyed by the two leaders on Thursday night. There was quite a bit of media coverage here in South Korea, as well as in neighboring Japan, about this rare arrangement of state dining. What are your thoughts, and how do you care to interpret it, if I were to ask you to put some meaning into it?
Yes, absolutely. Everybody loves to talk about food, don't they? And it's quite a unique arrangement to have two dinners. Just to recap, they first of all, they went to a sukiyaki restaurant for Japanese hot pot, and they also went to a more Western style restaurant for a very special dish that President Yoon has said he's enjoyed in the past, an omelette with fried rice dish. And I think that really shows that the Japanese put a lot of thought into how to set the right tone for this unique meeting. First of all, the restaurant, the hot pot restaurant, has a Michelin star, and so that really conveys the grandeur of this moment, of this event. This is the first time in 12 years, as we know, that such a visit has taken place. But also, they went the extra mile with hospitality by taking President Yoon to enjoy a dish that he has said that he really appreciated and he loved when he went to Japan in his youth. And I think using food as a diplomatic means to show warm ties is a great icebreaker. It was a gesture of friendship, of hospitality, and I think also if you look at that, the aesthetics of the restaurants as well, that they were quite intimate, informal. From the photos that we've seen, it was the two leaders and the two first ladies. And so there was a real opportunity there to reset ties in a very friendly and personal way.
Right, indeed. And Jacco, there has also been quite a bit of media focus on whether or not Japanese companies, including Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nippon Steel, would contribute to the foundation set up by the Yoon administration to compensate Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor. What appear to be the prospects on that particular front?
Yeah, so a quick bit of context or historical background there. The South Korean Supreme Court in 2018 found against both of those companies that you mentioned, saying that they have to compensate for wartime forced labourers from Korea, but both Mitsubishi Heavy and Nippon Steel appealed against that, saying that they believe that all compensation issues were finally and completely resolved back in 1965. Then in 2021 and 2022, South Korean courts seized some assets and shares and patents, saying that they should be liquidated to pay the compensation for the labourers. Now, as far as I know, that liquidation hasn't actually happened yet. It's still pending appeals tied up in the courts. But under the Korean Civil Code, if a debtor refuses to pay, a third party that has a, quote, legal interest with the debtor can pay that debt for them. So under this new deal between Korea and Japan that involves setting up this private fund in Korea to pay the forced labourers. Now, so far we've got Korean steel giant POSCO that has promised to pay a total of, I think, 14 billion won for that fund, and other donors include Seoul National University Alumni Association, KT, KT&G, KEPCO, Korea Expressway Corp and Hana Bank. Now, if that private fund compensates labourers under Korean law, that debt is seen as being paid off and deemed finished. So enforcement proceedings, including the seizure or liquidation of assets, won't go ahead. But it seems there's now also this second fund, which was announced yesterday, that between the major business lobbies of Korea, that's the Federation of Korean Industries, and the Japanese Keidanren, they've agreed to form this thing called a Future Partnership Fund to support cooperative projects like joint research on joint sort of common areas and issues and youth exchange programs. Now, as for these two companies, Nippon Steel and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, they said they would look into details of the plan, but they haven't yet committed to making any specific contributions yet. So I think it depends on how that money is going to be spent, and we really have to watch that in the future to see what happens.
Right, and in the meantime then, Nicola, generally speaking, what appears to be the tone taken up by the media in the West with regard to this latest summit between President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida?
I think overall it's a very positive tone. It's no secret that these are two of the United States' biggest allies in Asia, and that Washington has been very keen for them to put historical differences behind them and present a more united front, especially in dealing with the instability of the Indo-Pacific and growing volatility here. And the foreign media has considered, has presented Yoon's move as President Yoon's move as a bold and astute one that risks a political backlash in Korea, but at the same time it shows that resetting relations with Japan is a cornerstone of his foreign policy, that he does want to project South Korea's influence in the Indo-Pacific and also beyond the sole focus of relations with North Korea. There has been quite a bit of analysis about what this will mean, about the joint approach of Japan and South Korea and in how they deal with the North Korean threat. And there have been reports about the desire to share more military intelligence for more defense cooperation. I think there's been a bit of a focus also on shoring up economic ties and really looking at how to create more robust global supply chains, particularly in key industries like semiconductors, that would be insulated from volatility in the region. And then the foreign media has also been taking a wider look at the bigger picture of what this means regionally, and looking at concerns about China's growing military footprint across the region, its territorial ambitions. And this is something that publicly South Korea is being very careful on how it comments on this. It has strong trade relations with China and obviously doesn't want to do anything that would upset that balance. But China's increasingly assertive foreign policy in the region is a challenge to the US and its allies, and it's something that everyone's concerned about and looking at, how do we manage that?
Right, and staying with what Nicola said, Jacco, pundits are actually saying that security concerns, perhaps, as well as economic gains or potentially economic gains to be secured by the two countries, are ultimately what pushed Seoul and Tokyo to mend their ties, right?
Yeah, indeed, and we've had a lot of action from North Korea recently, talking about security issues. I mean, in the last 10 days, North Korea has had no fewer than 4 missile launch events. We had the 6 close-range ballistic missiles on March 9th, 2 submarine-launched cruise missiles on March 12th, and 2 short-range ballistic missiles on March 14th. And then yesterday, the big one, North Korea said that it had launched a Hwasong-17 intercontinental ballistic missile to counter what it calls the invasive US-South Korea drills. Now, Kim Jong-un and his daughter were photographed watching that launch, and that's the second successful Hwasong-17 launch this year. So in light of that, the South Korean government sources have denied that the US government under President Biden is applying direct pressure to resolve issues between Korea and Japan. But it's no secret that the United States wants to see both of its major alliance partners play nice with each other and work together to stand firm against North Korea's threats and also China's belligerence. And President Yoon himself acknowledged that in a time of multiple crises, Japan and Korea need to cooperate. And I think that the foreign observers, generally speaking, see South Korea and Japan as two countries where their past pulls them apart, but their future pulls them together. And it's not just for security reasons, but also in things like capitalist market economies, democracies, belief in a rules-based international order, efforts to fight climate change, a desire for peace in the Asian region. These are all things that pull the two nations together, or at least should try to. Now, meanwhile, China has expressed its grave concerns about these combined US-South Korean military drills that are going on, and they happen each year, every spring. Beijing has put out a statement calling on all parties concerned to, quote, remain restrained and do more things that are conducive to peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. Now, that sounds funny, given that these exercises are not done anywhere near the border with North Korea, so North Korea technically can't see them or feel threatened by them. All they have is media reports that they're going on. And calling on all parties to remain restrained, it sounds like it's even-handed, but in the context of North Korea firing missile after missile into the sea between Korea and Japan, it's actually a pretty milquetoast response, and it favours North Korea, in effect.
Right. Meanwhile, Nicola, going back to what we talked about with regard to Seoul's efforts to come up with a solution, of course, Seoul's solution, that is, to the compensation issue for Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor, what has been the response from the foreign media regarding that particular solution?
I think really it's been portrayed largely as a brave move by President Yoon to try and move South Korea beyond the past and into the present with Japan, and looking towards the future and how both countries can shore up their ties to deal with regional challenges. But there is also an acknowledgement within the foreign media that it is politically risky for President Yoon, that he does face a backlash domestically. He's come under heavy criticism from the opposition, who have called it the biggest humiliation in our history. There's been a very emotional response also from families who are affected by this deal, and polls have not been particularly favourable. There was a Gallup poll last week that showed about 59% of the population did not think it was a good way forward. And that is something that the foreign media has been very interested in, just watching how the Yoon administration negotiates or navigates this very difficult domestic landscape to try and push forward what they want to do here. And it does seem that they want to stay the course, that they do want to continue along this path. And the Prime Minister met with foreign journalists last week, and that was very much his message. He was saying, you know, we believe this is the right move, and that he did say that, you know, I'm paraphrasing here, that we should not allow the unhappy experience of the past to dictate the future for us.
Right, and staying with that, Jacco, there's also been a bit of talk about how long this particular solution will last. We have observers in Japan talking about, or taking reportedly, the been there, done that attitude. And what more do you care to add?
Yeah, it's hard to know how this will go in the future, how long this will last. Life is, of course, full of unpredictable events. I mean, just going back to 1974, only 9 years after the late President Park Chung-hee normalized relations with Japan, things were at seriously the worst stage ever, even worse than now, when an ethnic Korean stole a gun from a Japanese armory and came to Korea and tried to kill President Park, ended up killing his wife by mistake. And President Park at that moment almost cut off ties with Japan completely. And once again, it was America that helped to broker peace between the two. So I want to say that life is always full of surprises, unsuspected moments. Where will we be in the future? I think that both countries, Japan and Korea, need to invest some time and energy to build up a broader base of support. Referring to the Gallup poll that Nicola mentioned earlier, that there's 59% of South Koreans are not convinced that this is the right thing to do at the time. So if President Yoon is really convinced that this is right, then he and his government would be well served to spend some more energy and political capital to get the people behind them, so that this can be something that lasts a long time, and that it won't become a political tool again in the future.
Right. And Nicola, just as we mentioned earlier, hours before the Yoon-Kishida summit, North Korea chose to test launch an intercontinental ballistic missile. You covered this story as well. How are pundits responding, that is, to this latest display of defiance, if I may?
I think to a certain extent with some weary resignation that it was expected that ahead of the major drills that we've already been talking about, that it was expected that North Korea would respond in some way. That we are now seeing the largest joint military drills in 5 years, and North Korea has already expressed its deep displeasure about this, basically likening it to a rehearsal for war. And so there was an expectation that there would be some kind of missile launch. Obviously, an intercontinental ballistic missile is a big one. This is only the second time they've successfully launched this. And again, pundits or analysts are saying that it underscores the need for more cooperation. First of all, with Japan, even on a practical level, it's easier to see the launch from South Korea, and it's also easier from the Japanese end to collect data from where the missile comes down. We should see this also in the context of the bigger picture of what North Korea has been doing over the past couple of years. Last year, we know that there was an unprecedented number of weapons launches, and even in the past week, we've seen 4 missile launches. So again, analysts are saying, well, this is why we need these joint military drills, because we need to have a level of battle readiness. We need to be able to coordinate our forces in order to defend the Korean Peninsula if, in the worst case scenario. I spoke to Lieutenant General Chun In-bum last week. He obviously has a lot of experience in dealing with these drills and with North Korea's reaction, and he predicted that this would happen, that they would go back to this old tactic of using the drills as a pretext to launch a missile. And he said it was a shame that they are duping their own people in this way by saying that they need to sacrifice their rights and their freedoms for a non-existent threat. And I think there's basically a prediction that we'll see more of the same in the coming weeks.
Right, and staying with that, Jacco, do you believe the chances of further provocations by Pyongyang are very, very high?
If by provocations you mean further missile launches, then I would say that is high. I tend not to use the word provocation so much because we don't always know that North Korea intends to provoke when it does these things. We do know that South Korea is always feeling provoked by these things. So I don't want to blend the intent with the reception. But certainly the chances of more missile tests are very high. The chance of a 7th nuclear test is somewhat lower, but I don't want to put a number on that specifically as to how high that is. There's no sign at the moment that Kim Jong-un wants to talk to President Yoon Suk-yeol or to President Biden. And there are, in fact, just signs that North Korea wants to continue perfecting and increasing its own arsenal. So I predict more tests and more weapons build up for the rest of the year. I think that the chance of North Korea actually shelling an inhabited area in South Korea like it did with Yeonpyeong-do in late 2010 is quite low, and I'm glad of that, because personally that's not something that I would like to see at all.
Right, not of course, not at all, me neither. Jacco, do you suppose it's time for the international community to perhaps come up with a different approach to North Korea's rampant violations of UN security resolutions then?
But what would be a different approach? I mean, certainly smarter men and women than I go to each night praying that a smarter approach, a better approach, a more practical approach will present itself to them overnight. It never happens. We're in the 70th year of the Korean War Armistice Agreement, and with some small exceptions, that has held. And so I think that deterrence, that is convincing both sides that any military action would be foolish and would not achieve the desired outcomes, is the only thing that works for now. And I think that's the only way really forward, is to keep the armistice in place, keep deterring both sides from doing anything until the two Koreas can work out a practical and realistic solution for themselves, as late President Kim Dae-jung of South Korea and Chairman Kim Jong-il of North Korea pledged to do at their first and only summit meeting back in June 2000.
Right. Nicola, starting with the Seoul Tokyo summit this particular month, we have the Seoul-Washington summit scheduled for next month, April, and that will be followed by the Seoul-Tokyo-Washington summit in May. That being said, do you see these high-level back-to-back interactions serving to perhaps ensure some form of ease in regional tensions?
Well, that's certainly the aim. Unfortunately, these tensions remain. They exist. There are no easy solutions to any of the potential flashpoints for conflict in the region. And what these meetings show is a greater resolve by like-minded countries with similar values to try and find a joint solution to addressing them. And President Biden's invitation to President Yoon in April, that shows that South Korea is central to America's Indo-Pacific strategy, and it sees South Korea as essential to tackling the threat of North Korea and also the rise of China. And this is a very high-level state visit there have only been to in the Biden presidency, so that there's a lot of significance to that. There's also a wider effort beyond these meetings among regional democracies, again, like-minded countries who are trying to work together diplomatically, economically, and also militarily, just to try and prevent conflict and to deter any kind of crisis. We've seen this week an announcement on the AUKUS submarine deal between the UK, the US and Australia. We also have the Quad grouping of nations with India, Japan, Australia and the US, and many joint military drills. So this is all part of a bigger patchwork of nations who are trying to deflect crisis. And I would see the meetings between Japan and South Korea and the trilateral meetings and the meetings between South Korea and America as part of that bigger picture.
Right. Jacco, do you suppose that the two neighbours, South Korea and Japan, of course, have much more to gain perhaps from moving beyond their painful past to a more future-oriented present, as President Yoon-Suk-yeol has been vouching for?
Okay, you're asking for my personal opinion. I think that they do. I think that there's much more that they have to gain from working together. As I said before, not just in the security area, but also in terms of regional frameworks, things like democratic nations working together, Korea, and I mean, in this area of Northeast Asia, really Korea and Japan, and also let's include Taiwan in there, are working forwards towards very similar goals, which are not necessarily the same as their other near neighbours of Russia and China.
Right, I see. And Nicola, this is it could be a rather sensitive question, but very briefly, speaking within your capacity as a journalist who has been reporting on regional matters, does it appear to you as if Seoul perhaps has made more tangible concessions in efforts to mend ties with neighbouring Tokyo? And if that is the case, what action by Tokyo would perhaps serve to boost bilateral ties?
Well, Seoul certainly has made a big gesture, and somebody had to make the first move, and that's always what you have to do in diplomacy. There has to be someone to take that step forward. But I do think that Japan has reciprocated in its own way as well, that it has shown that it welcomes the move, that it's willing to also make some concessions to move forward. We saw yesterday that Japan has lifted export controls on the chemicals needed for the semiconductor industry, which allowed Seoul to then drop its WTO complaint. So that's already progress. And it may help relations further if some Japanese companies would like to contribute to the compensation fund also as a gesture of goodwill. I think that would certainly go a long way to finding more favourable public opinion in South Korea.
Right, and hopefully that will be the case then. All right, Nicola, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today.
Thank you.
And Jacco, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends Friday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Have a great weekend. See you on Monday.